Hi, everybody. Welcome in to all of you. So many familiar faces. It's so good to see you guys. I hope that you're having a great day. Thank you for letting me be a part of it. I've got a fun project for you guys, but before we get into that, I am Sara Lovecraft. I'm a designer with Beadalon, and wire is my love language. Now, I do make a lot of other things and use a lot of other materials, but wire is definitely my absolute favorite. And so we're going to be using some wire today to create a really fun pendant. I hope that you guys enjoy this one. Now, some of you may not be a fan of snakes, and if that is the case, that's okay. You can still take some of the techniques that you learn in today's project and use those to create some other fun shapes. It doesn't just have to be a snake. All right, so I'm going to get you guys turned around and we're going to get started right away. We're going to talk about what kind of wire we're going to be using for today's project. So excuse me, let's look at the sample here and we'll do a little breakdown of what we've got. So we're going to be using a combination of two different sizes of wire. We're going to be using some 18 gauge German style wire for the core or the structure of the snake. And then we're going to be using some 26 gauge artistic wire for the actual weaving. Now, excuse me, there is a difference between the two wires. And a lot of times people ask, why do I use a combination of two? It's really kind of just a preference. If you're using German style wire for the core or the structure and you still want to use German style wire for the weaving, you absolutely can. German style wire does come in that 26 gauge as well. But for me personally, I just find that when I'm using the really small gauge wires that I kind of like the artistic wire to do the weaving with. It is a dead soft wire, so it doesn't have any structure to it at all. It's very pliable, malleable, bendable. It's just really easy to use. So if you are a beginner with any kind of wire weaving, I definitely recommend doing the your first few, at the very least, wire weave projects with a combination of the German style wire for the structure and the artistic wire for the weaving. Now, once you get a little bit better at it, then if you want to do the weaving itself with some German style wire, you absolutely can do that. All right, so we are going to get started again using some 18 gauge wire here. We're going to be using about 12 inches of 18 gauge wire and then about 40 inches of the 26 gauge wire. So I have pre-cut my wire for you, and I do have a ruler on hand. It's pretty helpful, but we're going to bend this wire in half. It doesn't have to be exact, okay? So if you don't have a ruler on hand, that's okay. You can still do this without that. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our 12 inches of 18 gauge wire and we're going to bend that in half. And if you don't have a ruler, just take your two ends and bring those together. Okay, and you're going to come up here and just kind of start to give it a little squeeze like that. And you're going to see it's naturally going to kind of come to a point. We're going to take advantage of that point by then coming in with our flat nose pliers. So we're going to start right at the nose or the tip of the snake's head here. So that's what this little point right here is going to be. If you want to deepen that, you can just grab the wire with your flat nose pliers and give it a really sharp bend. But it's totally up to you. If you want it to be kind of more rounded, that's fine too. But what you want is you want a bend in the wire at that halfway mark, or as close to halfway as you can get it. Okay, then you're going to go ahead and use the rest of you're going to use your pliers to make the rest of the bends here. So I'm not going to have to use a ruler and like mark spots on the wire. I'm going to use the flat nose pliers, the width of the flat nose pliers, to make the measurements for me. So I'm going to grab the wire right up next to where that first bend is. And with one of the wires, I'm going to give it a bend right next to the edge of the pliers, right? And then I'm going to take that away. And you can see I've got a nice flat surface here. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, grabbing the wire right up next to where the bend is, and then bending the wire right next to the edge of the pliers. So you can see we've got that little shape here. It's like a little square, a little diamond. That's exactly what we want. It doesn't have to be exact, but it's pretty darn close because we use the pliers to be our guide. Now we're going to do another bend. So grabbing where you have bent the wire on either side, it doesn't really matter. You're going to grab and then you're going to bend again. And that is just going to take the wire in a new direction so that we can start to make our snake. Now, I like to go ahead and bend the other wire as well. However, if you want your snake's head to kind of be like this at the top, right? You don't have to make the other bend. So in other words, can see, you can do another bend. I'll just show you what that looks like, right? So if you bend again, you've got this shape, right? Which is more of a diamond, and then you can squeeze the two wires together, or you can leave that bend out, and it's going to kind of make the snake's head kind of off to the side a little bit, like he's looking to the left or to the right, depending on which way you want. So that's kind of up to you as far as like how you want your shape of your snake to look. I'm going to leave mine like that. I kind of like it. So this one, I did a clear bend right at the intersection of those wires. But for this one, I think I'm going to leave it just like that. So he's clearly going to be looking to one side, and I don't have to make any adjustments later on. Okay, so that's the shape that I've got. And now you should have your two wires running side by side, right? Two long wires here. And we are going to start our weave with our 26 gauge wire. So we're going to be using about 40 inches of your 26 gauge wire. And we're going to anchor that wire in the head section of the snake, about 4 inches from the end of the wire. So you want to give yourself a nice long tail here. And we are going to stick that through. And then I'm just going to anchor it right in here with about 3 or 4 wire wraps. And it doesn't matter if those sneak out of the head or not. It's fine because you're actually going to be moving that around a little bit anyways, but you just want to be sure that your 26 gauge wire is attached to your 18 gauge wire. So however that works for you, or wherever that works for you, is fine. Okay. All right. Now those are not the prettiest wraps in the world, but that's okay. They're serving a purpose, and I can always clean those up by pushing those wraps together with my fingers or with using my pliers. Okay, so now we're going to start our pattern, and I'm actually going to take the wire and I'm going to hold it with the head in my hand of my non-dominant hand. Okay, and we're going to start our wire weave, and our pattern is going to be 2 wraps around both wires and then 4 wraps around what is our bottom wire. So depending on how you're holding this, that's how that's going to go. Now for me, I like the 4 and 2, but you can change this up however you want to. You can do 2 wraps around both, 2 wraps around the bottom, 2 wraps around both, 3 around the bottom, 4 wraps around both, 4 wraps around the bottom. Like you can mix this up if you want to, but I do kind of like the way that it looks with the 4 and 2, but play around with it. That's the fun part of wire weaving. You can really kind of play and see what you like the look of. All right, so since my wire is kind of on the top wire here, since we've attached it, then I'm going to go ahead and do 2 wraps around both wires, which is nice because that's going to really kind of secure both of these wires together. So I'm going to do all the way around both wires once, all the way around both wires a second time. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap around, remember our pattern, 4 wraps just around this bottom wire. So in order to do that, I may need to separate the wires out a little bit, but I'm going to take that wire and I use my fingers to kind of open that up, coming out here to the side to bring that wire between the 2, and then kind of pulling back, pushing that first wrap right up against the 2 previous wraps. And we're going to do that 4 times. There's 3 and there's 4. And if they're not right up against, just kind of push them over. The first few are the most difficult, especially when you're trying to get them into such a small little space here. So you can push those over with your fingernails or push those over with your pliers, whichever works. Okay. All right. And then we are going to, and by the way, I'm working clockwise. I'm always wrapping clockwise with this. So I'm not going to change things up. This is a pretty straightforward, easy weave. So we're always doing clockwise motions. So I'm going clockwise around both wires, clockwise around both wires, and then clockwise just around the bottom wire 4 times. So there's 1, 2, 3, and 4. Pushing those over, making them as tight and as nice and neat as possible. And then around both wires 2 times. Okay, and then around the bottom wire. So let's kind of walk through that process again, because if this is the first time you've ever done wire weaving, it definitely helps to kind of know how to hold everything and to move your fingers until you get the hang of it. So you're going to wrap around this bottom wire, right, 4 times. But we're doing that out here on the outer edges between these 2 18 gauge wires out here, because it's much easier for me to do this out here and then pull it back into the spot that I need it than it is to find the edge of this, or the very end of this wire, right? Because we've got 40 inches of it. That's a lot. Finding the end of that wire and taking it individually like that, and then pulling it through. The wire can kink. There's lots of things. So it's much easier to do this out here on the edge. So for those wraps, we bring the wire. I kind of go ahead and my movement is upwards, right? Like I'm going to go up the front of the wire, and then I'm kind of sticking my fingers in between the 2 wires, coming out here, bringing the wire between the 2 wires way out here at the edge, right? And then I'm kind of pulling back, right, with my hand, kind of pushing and pulling at the same time. Okay, and then the same thing. So I go ahead and come upwards, but then I come out here to the edge to bring the wire, and then I pull it back up, out here to the edge, between the 2, pull back, up, out here to the edge, and then pull back. And you'll get used to that. The more you do it, it really just kind of becomes muscle memory, and I can do it pretty quickly. I try to slow it down for you guys, particularly those of you who are beginners, but sometimes I do kind of get in the zone and then I just keep going. But once you've seen the pattern a couple of times, then you really can just kind of let it happen, right? You just get into the groove and do the thing. All right. So, and we're not changing it up. We're going to do about 3.5 inches of this weave. So we're going to get lots of practice with this. 2 wraps around both, and then 4 wraps around the bottom. Okay. 2 wraps around both. And then 4 wraps around the bottom. So there's 1, 2, 3, and 4. Making sure every once in a while to just kind of stop and look at everything, push everything over. 2 around both. 4 around just the bottom. So there's 1, 2, 3, and 4. 2 around both. 4 around the bottom. So I had a question that said, do you flatten the weave? For this in particular, I don't find that it's necessary. I will show you though that you can, if you feel like the wires are not laying flat and they're giving you a little bit of trouble, one of the wires is wanting to kind of, move out of spot or whatever, you can take either your flat nose pliers or you can take your nylon jaw pliers. And you can just kind of bite down on that weave with that nylon jaw or flat jaw. If you're going to use your flat nose pliers, just be careful so that you don't mark up the wire. That's why I like to use the nylon jaw pliers to do that. But it kind of helps to just kind of flatten things out. I don't feel like you need to put it on a block and flatten it that way. It just kind of helps to really make those two 18 gauge wires stay in their place. Sometimes that can be tricky, particularly if you're not used to using wire, the German style wire, or two wires bent together to hold them in place. Using your pliers to really kind of train the wire is really, really helpful. All right, so 2 around both, and then 4 around the bottom. Okay, 2 around both, and then 4 around the bottom. Okay, 2 around both, and then 4 around the bottom. And then we are going to take that ruler and kind of check. We haven't really used the ruler much up until this point, but we do want about 3.5 inches of this. Unless you want a smaller snake, you can do less, or if you want a larger snake, you can do more, or longer rather. It's not really going to change his body shape much. He kind of is what he is. But looking at this, I'm starting the measurement from where the weave starts, where the two wires come together. So not at the tip of the nose, but where the weave itself starts. And you can see we're just over an inch, just barely over an inch of weave. So we need to do 2.5 more of those. And you can see this works up pretty quickly once you kind of get in the groove. You'll be able to do this in a lot less time than I think that you will think it's going to take. I know that those of you who have never done weaving before, it can be kind of intimidating, but I promise you, this is a pretty easy one. And I think that you will find that you'll get the hang of this one really quickly. And the more you practice a simple weave like this, the more confident you're going to become doing some more complicated weaves. So this is a great place to start. And like I said at the beginning, if you don't like snakes, that's okay. You could definitely turn this into anything you wanted to, or you could use this weave in other places. So hopefully I don't turn you off too much with the snake, but you do take away some technique here, regardless of whether you actually make it a snake or not. That's totally up to you. Because you could just make a wire swirl and it would be really pretty, add some crystals to it and call it a day. Doesn't have to be a snake. All right, we're just going to keep going. One thing about the weaving that you're going to find is that the shorter both wires become, the easier this process is. When you're weaving with a really long, thin wire, it can be a little tricky because managing a lot of wire is always hard. But not only is it nice when this wire starts to get a little bit shorter, but this wire as well, when you're not coming out way out here, you know, a foot worth of wire to the edge and then pulling back, the further you work your way down, the shorter this section becomes and a little bit easier it is. So I tried to pick a project where we weren't using tons of wire, but we're still getting some pretty cool results. So the shorter these wires become, the easier this weaving process is for sure. Just kind of taking a look at everything. Okay, so 4 around the bottom wire. And then 2 around both. I'm going to push everything over. 4 around just the bottom wire. And then 2 around both. 4 around the bottom. And then 2 around both. 4 around the bottom. and 2 around both. Okay, check that length again just to see, because this does work out pretty quickly. We're already at 2 inches, so we've got about 1.5 inches to go. And then we will really start to shape this into a snake or whatever shape you want it to be. Okay, so 4 around the bottom. And then 2 around both. 4 around the bottom. And 2 around both. Okay. All right, for this last little bit, I'm going to speed up. Weaving wire is getting nice and short, so it is so much easier to work with. The problem with just starting with a shorter wire in the first place is that you do have to add wire, right? Because if you're going to do 3.5 inches of wire, but instead of starting with 40 inches of your 26 gauge, you only start with 20 inches, that means that somewhere in here, you're going to have to add wire to this. And though that can be done, it's not impossible to add wire. It's definitely not a beginner kind of skill, right? Adding wire is one of those things that can be a challenge depending on the project. Now, for a project like this one, I would recommend doing it in the section where you're doing the 4 wraps around the bottom. I would finish off with your short wire with 2 wraps, and then add your new wire with 2 more wraps, and then proceed with your pattern. But when we do these, I try to keep them nice and simple. So I start with as much wire as I need so that we don't have to face that challenge until you become really comfortable doing these kinds of weaves. And then we face those kinds of challenges. So one thing at a time, right? Because adding wire can be a technique all in itself, depending on what the project is and what the weave is. So that's why I don't start with the shorter wires, even though they're much easier to work with. You kind of have to pick your battles with projects like this. Either start with short wire and know that you're going to add some, or just start with the long wire and have to deal with lots of wire. All right, so let's check our length again. And you can see my hands are kind of warming this up. It's kind of twisting it around. It's kind of doing its own thing. That's okay, because we're going to be shaping all of this ourselves anyways. So, all right, checking out, we're at 3 inches. We're going to do just a little bit more, or you could stop at this point. It doesn't have to be exactly 3.5 inches. Do whatever you want, but I am going to use up the majority of my 26 gauge wire here. All right, we're getting to where it's getting really short. So I'm actually going to use my pliers to help me a little bit, because sometimes when it gets too short, trying to get your fingers in there is just a little tricky. So using my pliers is nice. All right, let's check. So we're at about 3.25. That's enough for me since my wire is a little short. Like I said, it doesn't have to be exactly 3.5. That's kind of what you're going for, but we can stop here. Okay, so I'm going to come in with my cutter and I'm going to trim off the tail of that wire. Okay, now I am going to come back up here to the top, and we're going to go ahead and add our crystal to this. So we're going to use a bicone just to give his head a little bit of color, right? And you should have enough room here for adding a 6mm bicone. However, if yours is a little small, 4mm bicone will be fine. And it doesn't have to be a bicone. I just chose a bicone because of the shape of it. I thought that it looked nice, you know, with this kind of diamond head that he's kind of got. But honestly, any bead would work. All right, so I'm taking that tail. Remember, we've given ourselves about 3 or 4 inches worth of tail wire. I'm just kind of wire wrapping it over here to the center. So I'm just filling in that space with some wire wraps, making my way to the bend in that wire. And tidy that up a little bit. And it doesn't have to be exact either. Leave yourself enough room or enough wire though, so that you can add the bicone and wire wrap over here to anchor it. So I've got a little bit of wire. I'm going to go ahead and thread my bead on. I'm going to pop that right into the middle, and then I'm going to take the wire across to the other side, and I'm going to wire wrap it. Now, again, it's short, so you may need to use your pliers to help you. And just wrap around as many times as you want to. It's up to you. You can just use up the whole rest of the length of the wire if you want, or you can just trim it off. I'm going to do a couple more wraps, and then I'm going to cut mine off. Okay. All right, and then if you find that you don't like the way that this looks because there's a gap in the wraps, see how there's this open piece of wire here. If you wanted to, you could use the tail end of the wire that you had left over, or cut yourself another short piece of 26 gauge wire, and you can fill that in with wire wraps if you want to make it all wire wrapped, right? To make it, give it all that same texture. And you could do that here as well if you wanted to, or you can just leave it like it is. Totally up to you. You really get creative with this. It's your snake. It can look however you want it to. Okay, so now we're going to do the fun part. And the fun part is shaping in this to make the kind of S shape, whatever you want it to be. And then we will deal with the tail at the end. You can actually do the tail now if you want to, but I like to shape the wire. So we're going to just get right into the fun part. Now, you can use a combination of your nylon jaw pliers or your fingers to do this. It's really kind of up to you, but my suggestion is slow movements, because number one, you are shaping a wire that is woven, so it's thick already. But if you make sharp bends in this and you don't like the way that it looks, you will never be able to fix it again. So that's why I say you do slow movements to get this to look how you want. And you can either start at the head, or you can start at the bottom, or you can start in the middle. It really makes no difference. But you can curl this around however you want it to look. You can use some sort of mandrel if you want to help shape your wire, but I find that since it's not a singular wire, that it really doesn't help all that much. For me, just using my fingers is the best. You do what works for you. And I'm always kind of coaxing the wire and flattening it. That's why it's nice to have your nylon jaw pliers, because as you are bending this wire around, it's going to want to kind of pop out of place for you. In other words, these two 18 gauge wires, the one that has less wire wraps on it, it's going to want to kind of twist. because it has a little bit more room to move. So when that happens, coming in with your nylon jaw pliers and just kind of flattening it down again is really helpful. And you can make this look however you want. Like I said, there's no right or wrong with this. It's just whatever you like. And I've found that there's no way to make them. I can never make two exactly the same. So when I go into these kinds of projects, I always know that like they're gonna look very, very different than the sample, and I'm okay with that. So now if you're trying to make earrings, I definitely suggest that you do both at the same time, so that you're kind of making the same movements to get them as close to looking the same as possible. But for me, I just kind of stick to pendants because it takes the pressure of trying to make two that match off. If I can avoid making two that match, or at least try, then I'm definitely going to do that, right? Let myself off the hook and just make a pendant out of it. Forget earrings. All right, he's looking like a snake for sure. Now, again, doesn't look exactly like the other one, but I'm okay with that. He has his own little personality here. And you can deepen those. You can make them more shallow as far as all of your little curves are concerned. It's very organic. He's a snake, right? So, right. And I definitely want to kind of turn that head a little bit more. All right, so you get him into whatever shape you want, and then you deal with the tail, okay? And the tail is another one of those things, sort of like shaping him into the shape that you want. Get creative with it, because you've got two wires to work with here, and you can use both wires, or you can trim one of them off. With this one, I messed with it a lot, trying to get it to look the way that I wanted to, and ultimately I kind of trimmed one wire. So one of the wires, when you look at it in the front, it looks like they just come together and it just magically turns into one single wire. But in reality, back here on the back, that wire is cut. So do I love that? Not particularly, because it means that, this could potentially get hung on your clothing. But looking at it from the front, it looks great. But, I don't know that that's necessarily the most practical thing to do. But play with it and come up with whatever you want. So I'm going to separate the two wires out from each other, and then I'm actually going to trim some of this off, because I don't need all of this extra wire unless you just want to get really creative and do all kinds of swirls, and you absolutely can do that. But for me, I am just going to take my stepped bell making pliers so that I've got some options as far as like how deep I want the curves and the swirl to be. And I'm just going to start kind of swirling this around just like that at the bottom. And again, you can make it tight, you can make it, it's up to you. Just swirling that around. And then I'm going to take the other wire and kind of follow that curve. And not exactly sure. I didn't trim any of this off. That might be a little bit more helpful to trim some of it off. Not sure what I want to do with this. I definitely want to take it to the back. And can swirl that around a little bit more, trim some more of that off. Make it a little bit tighter with my stepped bell making pliers. Because obviously a tail, he only has one tail, but you're dealing with 2 wires. So that can be a little tricky. It's, however, an opportunity for you to get a little creative. And you really doesn't have to look like 2 wires. It can just look like 1 wire just all coiled up. We don't know how long that snake is, right? He could be really long. And so his coil is kind of thick, right? A lot of snake there. I don't know. But play around with it and kind of decide what it is that you want it to look like, and then just shape it up. And honestly, you've got a nice little swirl here. You could hang another bead or a cluster of beads or something else from that if you wanted to, right? And then you can still kind of play around with it, right? Oh, Tammy said put some seed beads on the tail and give it a rattle. I like that. Make it a little rattlesnake. That's cool. And you can actually wire wrap other things to this, right? Speaking of seed beads, if you wanted to, you could wire wrap, some seed beads to the outside edge of this, or some smaller crystals to the outer edge of this if you wanted to. Get creative. This snake can be whatever you want it to be, right? And can be whatever shape you want it to be as well. So you can see mine are very different. I mean, they kind of have the same thing going on, but they're different, right? All right, and then to finish this off, all you are going to do is you are just going to use your pliers to attach a jump ring. You can put that jump ring anywhere you want. Let me grab a jump ring here. That was the one thing I did not get out. I should have. So there's my jump ring. And use my pliers here, open up this jump ring. Now you can put this jump ring, I'll show you. You can put it on this side so that he hangs straight up and down, right? Or you can put it behind the wire wrap and behind the bead so that he kind of hangs more at an angle instead of just being straight up and down. It's totally up to you. It's the fun part of all of these projects is that you can really customize this however you want it to be, right? And then you're just going to add that to whatever stringing material. You can use chain, you can use leather, you could bead a whole necklace around it if you wanted to. Totally up to you. Let's stick a piece of chain through this and see what it looks like hanging. I got a knot in my chain here. Okay, I don't have the time to mess with that. We're just going to pretend like there isn't a knot in that. We're just going to thread this on here. What knot? There's no knot in that chain. What are you talking about? It's okay. All right. And there you go. All right. I'm going to turn you guys around and I'm just going to hold it up against a bust so you can kind of see what it looks like when it's hanging. And you can see for mine, both of mine, the jump ring is more towards the back of the head. So it's behind the bead, both of those. So play around with it as far as like how you want that to hang. All right, let me turn you around. This has been a fun project. I hope that you guys have enjoyed this one. And like I said, if you don't like a snake, that's okay. You can turn this into any kind of swirly fun that you want. It doesn't have to be, oh gosh, it doesn't have to be a snake. Though I do think they're kind of cool. Somebody in the comments mentioned that you could make a ring out of this. You 100% can do that. So instead of shaping this around like, you know, an S or whatever shape you want, if you wanted to take a ring mandrel and before you do any shaping to this, wrap it around a ring mandrel, you 100% can make a ring out of it. So this actually helps you to make, doesn't help, it allows you the ability to make more than one project out of this if you wanted to. So if you wanted to take the exact same techniques and just wrap it around a ring mandrel, you could actually do like a set. So you could have like the necklace and the ring. If you wanted to do smaller versions and do 2 at a time, you could do earrings, or you could kind of bend this and you could put a jump ring here with the jump ring there, and he could be the center of a bracelet. So a lot of different things that you can do with this little guy, including not making a snake at all. I have to say that because some people just don't like snakes. Sometimes around the spooky holidays, I make spiders and people are like, "Oh no, spiders!" And I'm like, "No, but they're so cute." And it's the techniques that you learn. It's not necessarily about what it is. So hopefully I didn't turn you off. This one doesn't bite. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining me for another fun class. Don't forget that you can watch this as a video on demand, so you can fast forward through all of the chat in the beginning and get straight to the technique or the part of the project that you need. And while you are doing that, be sure that you are checking out all of the other incredible tutorials that are available over on the Michaels website and the Michaels YouTube channel, because there's so much there. You could be inspired for days. So, all right, guys, thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you again soon with another fun project. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Bye, guys.